The birth of a monster in the shadow of power. On the morning of March 16, 37 C, the streets of Rome erupted with celebration. After years of fear, whispers, and suffocating suspicion under the dark rule of Tiberius, the old emperor was dead. The Roman people believed a nightmare had ended. Their cheers echoed through stone forums and along the winding alleys of the city, rising toward the Palatine Hill, where a new ruler was about to ascend. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. The world would remember him by a darker name, Caligula. To many Romans, the death of Tiberius felt like a release from a long, cold imprisonment. The last years of Tiberius had been spent in near total isolation on the island of Capri, ruling through terror at a distance, guided by informers, false charges, and executions ordered by letters carried across the sea. Under this suffocating atmosphere, no one felt safe. Senators disappeared overnight. Noble families were erased by accusation alone. Even laughter could be fatal if it reached the wrong ears. Into this exhausted empire stepped a young man of just 24 years of age, handsome, charismatic, and descended from one of Rome's greatest military heroes. To the masses, Caligula was not a tyrant. He was not yet a monster. He was the son of Germanicus, the beloved general whose victories across the Rhine had made him the darling of the legions and the people alike. Germanicus had been seen by many as Rome's future before his mysterious death in 19 CE. His shadow still stretched across the empire nearly 2 decades later. Caligula's childhood had unfolded beneath banners and marching boots. As a boy, he had lived among the soldiers on campaign, dressed in a miniature uniform, boots included. The soldiers adored him and gave him a nickname that would follow him forever. Caligula means little boots. At the time, it was a term of affection. None could imagine how stained with blood that name would one day become. But behind the smiling child of the legions lay a childhood steeped in betrayal, poison, and sudden death. After the fall of Germanicus, power struggles inside the heart of the Roman Empire turned vicious. Caligula's mother, Agrippina the Elder, was a woman of fire and ambition. She believed her sons were destined to rule. This belief made her dangerous in the eyes of Tiberius. One by one, Caligula watched his family destroyed. His mother was exiled and starved to death. 2 of his brothers were accused of treason and killed. The young Caligula survived only because he learned the most important lesson of imperial Rome. Silence is survival. As a teenager, Caligula was summoned to Capri to live under the watchful eye of the same emperor who had destroyed his family. Life on Capri was a theater of paranoia. Tiberius trusted no one. Whispers of cruelty surrounded the aging emperor. Executions were ordered daily. Senators lived in constant terror, forced to praise their ruler while expecting death at any moment. Caligula learned to smile while his heart hardened. He learned when to kneel, when to flatter, and when to remain utterly expressionless. Observers noted that he never laughed openly, never spoke freely, and never showed his true thoughts. He had become, as one later Roman writer described him, the perfect survivor of tyranny. When Tiberius finally died in 37 CE, many believed poison had hastened his end. Some whispered that Caligula himself had smothered the old emperor with his own hands. Whether true or not, what mattered was that power now stood unguarded before a man who had spent his life learning how dangerous power could be. The first months of Caligula's reign stunned Rome. The Senate expected revenge. They received mercy. He released prisoners unjustly detained. He recalled exiles. He burned the treason records that had condemned so many under Tiberius. Public games returned to the city. Taxes were reduced. He stood before the people not as a tyrant but as a savior. For the first time in years, Romans felt hope. Coins were minted bearing his face alongside those of his beloved parents. Statues of Germanicus were dusted off and placed once more into public view. Caligula walked openly among the crowd, greeting citizens, charming foreign envoys, and embracing the image of a young prince born to heal the empire's wounds. For a brief moment it seemed Rome had been rescued from the brink. Then, in the autumn of 37 CE, something broke. Caligula fell violently ill. Ancient writers describe days of raging fever, delirium, and agony. Rome held its breath. Senators whispered in corridors. The people gathered in temples, begging the gods to spare their young emperor. When Caligula recovered, the city erupted in celebration once again. But those who looked into his eyes after the illness saw something had changed. The mercy vanished first. One by one, those who had prayed for his death during the crisis were identified. Some were forced to commit suicide. Others vanished quietly. The message was unmistakable. Survival under Caligula would not be granted by friendship, loyalty, or even obedience. It would be granted by fear. From that moment onward, the Rome that had briefly tasted relief began to sink into a nightmare without precedent. Caligula demanded worship not merely as a ruler, but as a living god. Temples were altered. Statues of the gods were ordered to have their heads replaced with his own. Senators were forced to kneel before him as if he were Jupiter incarnate. To resist was to die. His cruelty toward the upper classes was methodical and personal. Wealthy senators were accused of obscure crimes and executed so their estates could be seized. Trials were staged not to seek justice, but to provide entertainment. The screams of the condemned became spectacle, yet even blood failed to satisfy him. Caligula discovered that terror alone was not enough. He craved humiliation. Senators were forced to run alongside his chariot like slaves. Noblewomen were dragged before him and displayed as trophies. He mocked the traditions that had built Rome, shattering centuries of decorum with calculated delight. Within the palace, the boundaries of family, religion, and power collapsed entirely. His relationships with his sisters shocked even a society accustomed to scandal. Drusilla became his constant companion, openly treated as both wife and goddess. When she died suddenly in 38 CE, Caligula plunged into a grief so violent that all public business ceased. He declared her divine. He condemned those who mourned too little and those who mourned too much. Mourning itself became a crime punishable by death, because grief was now his private possession alone. The same man who had once burned treason lists now created new ones daily. Rome had traded the silent terror of Tiberius for something far more unstable. Under Caligula, fear became unpredictable. Survival was no longer about obedience alone. It was about guessing the emperor's shifting moods, his sudden laughter, his rapid turns from generosity to slaughter without warning. The empire stood at the edge of something monstrous. What had begun as the hopeful reign of a beloved hero's son had twisted into a rule driven by ego, vengeance, and absolute power without restraint. The floodwaters of blood, lust, and terror had only begun to rise. By the beginning of 38 CE, the transformation of Caligula was no longer whispered in back corridors. It was openly visible in the streets of Rome itself. The young emperor who had once walked among the people as a savior now rode above them in towering processions, draped in silk and gold, his face cold and unreadable. Power had not merely corrupted him. It had consumed the last human restraint that had kept his darkness caged. Caligula's need for worship expanded beyond politics and into ritual. He no longer wished to be honored like a ruler. He demanded reverence as a god in flesh. Temples across the Roman world were ordered to install statues of him alongside Jupiter, Mars, and Apollo. In some cities, ancient idols were torn down to make space for his image. Priests were forced to alter prayers so that his name was invoked beside the immortal gods. To refuse was treason. To hesitate was death. Even the sacred Jewish temple in Jerusalem was commanded to receive a statue of the emperor. This order nearly ignited full rebellion across the eastern provinces. Only delays, political maneuvering, and finally Caligula's own assassination years later prevented a religious catastrophe that could have drowned the region in blood long before Rome itself collapsed into civil war. Inside the capital, the Senate was stripped of all dignity. Senators were summoned not to debate law, but to witness humiliation. Some were ordered to dance naked before the imperial court. Others were forced to proclaim their own unworthiness before being sent into exile or execution. Rome's ruling class had become stage props in a theater of imperial cruelty. The games grew more brutal. Gladiatorial contests expanded into mass executions disguised as entertainment. Criminals, political enemies, and even common citizens accused on vague charges were thrown into the arena to be torn apart by beasts. When funding ran short, Caligula invented new enemies to kill. When the prison emptied, he restocked it. Yet it was not only Rome that suffered. The emperor's cruelty expanded outward into the provinces of the empire. Governors were removed without trial, replaced not for efficiency, but for loyalty to Caligula's divine identity. Taxation spiked as the emperor drained imperial coffers into his own endless extravagance. Entire treasuries were consumed by palaces, floating villas, jeweled chariots, and endless banquets where gold dust was scattered onto food so that even his meals symbolized divine excess. Caligula's obsession with wealth was matched only by his obsession with degradation. He opened a public brothel inside the imperial palace, staffed by noblewomen forced into prostitution. Senators were compelled to bid openly for their services. Wives of respected families were paraded as commodities while their husbands stood powerless in the crowd. The purpose was not money alone. It was domination. Within his own family, the last barriers of morality dissolved. After Drusilla's death, Caligula's behavior grew even more unrestrained. He took his remaining sisters as lovers. He forced marriages, broke alliances, and executed relatives on rumor alone. Even the inner circle of the imperial household lived with the certainty that survival might end before sunset. The army, once the proud backbone of his identity as Germanicus' son, gradually turned from admiration to quiet terror. Officers were executed for imagined insults. Legions were humiliated for failures that had never occurred. Promotions were granted not for merit but for blind obedience. The emperor no longer trusted victory. He trusted only fear. In 39 C, Caligula staged one of the most grotesque spectacles of imperial absurdity in Roman history. Declaring war against the sea itself, he marched legions to the coast of northern Gaul. Soldiers were lined up in full formation as if an enemy stood before them. When the imaginary battle began, Caligula ordered his men to charge directly into the surf. Then, with waves crashing against their armor, he commanded them to collect seashells as spoils of conquest. The shells were later paraded through Rome as trophies triumphed from the defeated ocean. The message was unmistakable. There would be no logic. There would be no reason. The emperor's will alone defined reality. At the same time, Caligula conceived plans that went beyond madness into pure theatrical terror. He announced his intention to move the capital of the Roman Empire to Alexandria in Egypt, transforming Rome itself into a provincial memory. This threat struck at the core of Roman identity. The Senate begged, the people whispered, the empire trembled beneath the possibility that its ancient throne would be discarded like a broken toy. But perhaps nothing revealed Caligula's contempt for life more than his relationship with death itself. Executions became casual. He once reportedly lamented that the Roman people had only one neck. His dream was not justice. His dream was efficiency. Mass slaughter fascinated him not for its political purpose, but for its spectacle. Public executions were timed to his meals so he could watch suffering between courses. Condemned men were forced to die slowly so that the emperor would not grow bored. Others were thrown to beasts without weapons, screaming beneath amphitheater skies, while Caligula laughed at their terror. Even mercy became a tool of torment. Some prisoners were spared not out of kindness, but so their families could suffer longer. Others were freed publicly only to be accused again days later, crushed beneath false reprieve. Yet beneath this ocean of blood and humiliation, another force was stirring. Fear had always been Rome's ruler. But fear, stretched too far, can turn inward. The Senate was broken. The people were terrified. The army, however, was beginning to calculate. Caligula's contempt for the Praetorian Guard was particularly fatal. This elite force was charged with the emperor's personal protection. Under prior rulers, they had been kingsmakers. Under Caligula, they became pawns. Their pay was irregular. Their officers were publicly mocked. Their loyalty was tested through humiliation instead of trust. The very force meant to shield him from danger was quietly becoming his executioner in waiting. By the start of 41 CE, conspiracies were whispering through corridors of marble and shadow. The names of plotters changed as fear shifted alliance after alliance. Some conspiracies died in their infancy when informers betrayed them for survival. Others grew bolder as the emperor's isolation deepened. Caligula believed himself untouchable. He believed that gods could not bleed. On the morning of January 24, 41 C, he left the palace to attend games at the theater. He walked through hidden corridors without full escort, guarded only by a small detail. The emperor who had forced senators to kneel now walked casually into a narrow passageway where marble walls pressed close on both sides. There, blades flashed. The first dagger plunged into his neck. A second pierced his chest. Panic erupted in the corridor as guards and conspirators collided in chaos. Caligula fell, screaming, his divine illusion unraveling in blood on stone. More wounds followed until the emperor of Rome lay unmoving at the feet of men he had spent years humiliating. Above, the games continued for a brief time, the audience unaware that their god had just died like any other mortal. When word spread through the city, Rome did not erupt in mourning. It erupted in disbelief, then uncertainty, then fear. The monster was dead, but monsters do not die alone. When the body of Caligula lay cooling in the hidden corridor of the palace on January 24, 41 C, the Roman Empire did not feel relief at once. It felt shock. Terror had ruled so completely, so unpredictably, that the absence of the monster created a silence more frightening than his presence. No one knew who now held power. No one knew who might be next. The Praetorian Guard, having murdered their emperor, faced a terrifying truth. Killing Caligula had freed Rome from a tyrant, but it had also shattered the sacred illusion that the emperor was untouchable. If one emperor could be slaughtered in a corridor like a common criminal, then no ruler was safe. The Guard moved swiftly to secure itself before the Senate could reassert authority. While Rome trembled, fate hid in plain sight behind a curtain. Within the palace complex, panic spread among the imperial household. Servants fled. Courtiers concealed themselves. Soldiers hunted for any remaining threats. Amid this chaos, a trembling figure slipped through shadows. He was no warrior, no general, no command figure. He was a man long mocked, ignored, and underestimated. His name was Claudius. Claudius was the uncle of Caligula. For most of his life, he had lived as a joke within the imperial family. He stammered, he limped. His hands shook. These physical frailties, combined with a quiet scholarly nature, had saved his life under prior reigns. Tiberius dismissed him as harmless. Caligula ridiculed him openly at banquets and threw objects at him for sport. No one considered him a threat. As assassins swept through the palace, killing anyone connected to Caligula's regime, Claudius hid behind a hanging curtain. Legend holds that a Praetorian soldier discovered him shaking in terror. Instead of killing him, the soldier bowed. Within hours, the Praetorian Guard proclaimed Claudius emperor. The Senate reacted with fury and desperation. Many senators believed that with Caligula dead, the empire could return to the old republic. They rushed to the Senate House, debated wildly, and even spoke of restoring collective rule. But debate was no longer backed by armies. The Praetorians held the palace, they held the treasury, and now they held the emperor. Claudius was brought before them not as a conqueror, but as a hostage crowned with a diadem. Yet something unexpected happened. Once placed in power, Claudius did not collapse. The man who had survived by being overlooked transformed into a decisive ruler. To the shock of Rome, he proved competent, calculating, and remarkably stable. For the first time in 4 years, the city began to breathe. The destruction left behind by Caligula, however, could not be erased by a single assassination. The empire's finances lay in ruins. The treasury had been emptied by obscene luxury. Grand projects had gone abandoned mid-construction, stripped of funding after the emperor grew bored. Taxes had crushed the provinces. Administrations had been dismantled and rebuilt on whims. Trust in law had been replaced by terror. Claudius immediately faced the task of repairing an empire that no longer trusted itself. He restored discipline among the Praetorian Guard through rewards and firm control, understanding better than any man alive how dangerous insult could be when aimed at armed men. He restored legal procedures within the courts. He recalled exiles. He executed only those whose crimes were too notorious to ignore. Slowly, order returned to the streets, but Caligula's legacy could not be erased from memory. In the years that followed, Roman writers struggled to describe what they had witnessed. Suetonius documented Caligula as a ruler who blurred the line between godhood and insanity. Cassius Dio wrote of an emperor who delighted in destruction for its own sake. Their accounts echoed across centuries not as political critique alone, but as warnings. Caligula became the symbol of what happens when absolute power fully severs itself from restraint. Yet history is rarely born from madness alone. Beneath Caligula's cruelty lay a deeper truth about Rome itself. The empire had created a system in which one man held the power of a god over millions. It demanded that he be worshipped, obeyed without limit, and feared above law. Under a stable ruler, this system could function with brutal efficiency. Under an unstable ruler, it became an engine of apocalypse. The Senate, long stripped of real authority, was exposed as hollow theatre. The legions ruled where ideology failed. Wealth decided survival more often than innocence. The emperor was no longer first among equals. He was something closer to an untouchable sovereign deity. Caligula did not invent this system. He was its most vivid consequence. Even after his death, the scars he carved into Rome's psyche endured. Parents taught children never to speak carelessly of power. Senators learned to measure every word, every expression, every silence. The public learned that crowds could cheer a ruler in the morning and trample his statues by night. In distant provinces, news of Caligula's assassination spread, followed by relief, then by renewed loyalty to Claudius. Cities that had trembled beneath religious decrees now rebuilt temples without fear of divine replacement. Governors once chosen by cruelty were replaced with men of experience. Trade slowly recovered, yet the shadow of Caligula remained long enough to shape the reigns that followed. Every emperor afterward would be judged against him. Was he another Caligula? Was he hiding madness beneath ceremony? The name itself became synonymous with unrestrained tyranny. Even centuries later, to call a ruler another Caligula meant he had crossed beyond cruelty into something far darker. And still, one question haunted Roman memory. What had truly broken him? Some believed his illness in 37 CE damaged his mind. Others argued that prolonged exposure to terror under Tiberius twisted his soul long before power ever crowned his head. Still, others believed that Caligula had always been what he became, and power simply stripped away the mask. The truth is likely all of these at once. He was a child raised in blood, a survivor trained in silence, a young ruler handed infinite power without boundaries. His transformation was not sudden. It was the steady unfolding of every unchecked instinct made law simply by command. In death, Caligula lost his throne, but Rome never truly escaped what he represented. By the time the reign of Claudius stabilized the Roman world in the months following January 41 CE, a strange certainty had settled over the empire. The terror was over, but the memory of it would never fade. Caligula was dead, yet his shadow lingered in law, architecture, politics, and fear itself. Rome had learned, in the most brutal way imaginable, what happens when absolute power is handed to an unstable mind without restraint. Claudius ruled carefully, precisely, because he understood what Caligula had revealed. The emperor was no longer simply a political leader. He had become a living symbol of fate itself. Every public appearance of Claudius carried the silent question on the lips of the people. Would he become another Caligula? It did not happen. Claudius governed with method, caution, and relentless focus on law. He expanded infrastructure, repaired aqueducts, improved grain supply, and strengthened provincial administration. Yet even his successes could not erase the truth that Rome's political system still balanced on a knife edge. The emperor remained absolute, and because Caligula had shown how horrifying absolute power could become, future rulers were forever measured against his madness. When Nero later ascended the throne, Romans watched him with the same nervous tension once reserved for storms. Every cruel order was compared to Caligula. Every act of spectacle was weighed against the memory of shells gathered as spoils of war. Every execution revived the echo of the corridor where Caligula fell. In later centuries, philosophers dissected his reign not as a personal failure alone, but as a failure of institutional control. Caligula proved that fear is not a stable foundation for empire. It consumes everything beneath it and eventually turns inward. He ruled by terror, and terror, once unleashed, spares no throne. The Roman people themselves were permanently changed by his 4 years of blood-soaked spectacle. Before Caligula, many still believed the empire could be guided by tradition, duty, and shared values. After Caligula, belief gave way to realism. Power was naked. Survival was uncertain. Loyalty was transactional. Even religion was never the same again. Caligula had forced Rome to confront a dangerous contradiction. The emperor was revered as divine, yet was visibly mortal. When Caligula declared himself a god and then died screaming beneath daggers, the illusion shattered. Later emperors would still accept divine honors, but never again with the same reckless certainty that gods could not fall. This tension reshaped imperial propaganda for generations. Emperors learned to appear modest even while ruling absolutely. They learned to wear the mask of restraint because Caligula had proven what happens when the mask is discarded. Yet the fascination with him never died. Roman writers, poets, and historians returned again and again to his reign. Tacitus, whose works shaped later understanding of imperial corruption, saw Caligula as a symptom of unchecked monarchy rather than its cause. Suetonius recorded his sexual excesses, his cruelty, and his theatrical insanity in chilling detail, not to gossip, but to document the extremes power could reach. Cassius Dio framed Caligula as a lesson written in blood for every future generation. Even the modern world continues to return to Caligula as a symbol. His name no longer refers only to a historical figure. It has become a warning label attached to unchecked authority. To call a ruler another Caligula is not merely to accuse him of cruelty. It is to accuse him of detaching from humanity itself. One of the most haunting truths about Caligula is that for a brief moment he was loved. The same crowds who later trembled beneath his cruelty once cheered his mercy. The same Senate that later conspired to kill him once praised him as Rome's golden hope. The same guards who later stabbed him once swore to protect him with their lives. His rise and fall expose a terrifying reality. Monsters are not born alone. They are built by systems that fail to restrain them. Caligula did not begin his reign spilling rivers of blood. He began by freeing prisoners. He did not begin by humiliating the Senate. He began by honoring his father. He did not begin by demanding worship as a god. He began as a young ruler trying to be loved. The transformation was gradual, and that is what makes it so unsettling. Each act of cruelty normalized the next. Each excess widened the boundary of what Rome would tolerate. By the time the horror reached its full scale, the empire no longer remembered how to stop it without assassination. This is the true legacy of Caligula, not simply murder, not simply lust, not simply terror, but the revelation that the machinery of empire could amplify madness instead of stopping it. And when the machinery finally broke, it did so violently. The final moments of Caligula's life were not divine. There was no thunder, no prophecy, no heavenly intervention. There was only stone under his body, blood pooling in silence, and the sound of his killers retreating into history. The god of Rome had died like a man. In that moment an emperor fell, and a warning was born for all future rulers. Caligula's story endures not because it is sensational, but because it is structurally eternal. Wherever power exists without limit, wherever fear replaces law, wherever worship replaces accountability, the path toward another Caligula quietly opens. Rome survived him. The empire continued for centuries. Roads were built, laws were enforced, battles were won and lost. But the myth of the untouchable emperor died forever in that narrow corridor, and in its place history left behind a lesson carved in blood. No ruler is a god, and every god who believes himself immortal will eventually bleed.